Imagine a small town in America, calm, peaceful. Until the government comes to bring a mental health program. They recruit volunteers, he said. Just a memory test, a sleep test. There is no risk. But week after week, residents are starting to change. Those who used to be friendly became paranoid. The quiet one, so brutal, one housewife ensnared her husband with a cable. A teacher stabs his student for no reason. There is no explanation. Only darkness spreading. Only years later, CIA documents leaked. MKUltra, Project LSD, hypnosis, brainwash. Everything is done secretly, in that city. And the most terrible? Many of them never knew they were guinea pigs.